The chill wind carried the scent of coming rain as Clara Harlow stood shivering at the edge of Ardmore, Oklahoma Territory, 1889. She wasn't cold from the weather, it was her own shame that froze her from within. Tonight would be the third time this month she'd have to walk through the swinging doors of the Dusty Boot Saloon, not for a drink, but to sell the only thing she had left of value, herself. Clara pulled her worn shawl tighter across her shoulders and glanced back toward the small shack she called home, where her children Emma, age 7, and Thomas, just turned 5, slept under the watchful eye of elderly Mrs. Winters from next door. The thought of their innocent faces twisted her heart. They believed their mama cleaned the saloon after hours. A bitter lie, but better than the truth. "Lord, forgive me," she whispered, blinking back tears as she forced herself to take the first step toward town. 4 months ago, her husband Daniel had been crushed under a fallen wagon during a storm. No warning, no goodbye, just a man from the general store appearing at her door, hat in hand, eyes downcast. Since then, Clara had tried everything honest to keep food on the table: laundry, mending, baking. But in a frontier town where most folks were just scraping by themselves, charity ran thin, and paying work for a woman with 2 small children was scarcer than rain in August. The first time she'd gone to the Dusty Boot, she'd only intended to ask about washing dishes. But Mabel, the hardened woman who managed the upstairs girls, had taken one look at Clara's desperate eyes and still pretty face and offered her more money for one night than she could make in 2 weeks of laundry. Clara had refused, storming out in righteous indignation. But 3 days later, with Emma crying from hunger pains and little Thomas growing thinner by the hour, she'd returned, head bowed, and taken the money Mabel offered. The lights of Ardmore's Main Street now glowed ahead, and Clara could hear piano music spilling from the saloon. She paused, drawing a shuddering breath. Just one more night, she told herself. Just enough to buy food for another week, maybe medicine for Thomas's cough. As she approached the back entrance of the Dusty Boot, a commotion erupted from the front of the building. Shouting, then the crash of breaking glass. Clara instinctively pressed herself against the wall of the adjacent feed store, her heart hammering. "I said that's enough." A deep voice thundered above the din. "Any man who cheats at my table doesn't get a second chance." The saloon's batwing doors burst open, and a man came flying backward through them, landing hard in the dirt street. He scrambled to his feet, hand reaching for his gun, but froze at the sight of the tall figure now standing in the doorway. Even from her hiding place, Clara could see the stranger was different from the usual rough crowd. He stood straight as a fence post, his shoulders broad under a dust-covered duster coat. The brim of his hat was pulled low, but she caught the glint of eyes that seemed to miss nothing as they swept the street. "Don't even think about it," the stranger said calmly to the ejected man. "You'll be dead before that pistol clears leather, and we both know it." The would-be gunman's hand twitched, hovering by his holster, then fell away. With a string of curses, he staggered off into the night. Clara realized she'd been holding her breath and let it out slowly. She should go now, slip through the back door as Mabel had instructed. But something about the tall stranger held her in place. He turned slightly, and the lamplight caught his face, strong-jawed, weather-beaten, with a thin scar running along his right cheekbone. Not young, but not old either. Maybe 35. His eyes, now visible beneath the hat brim, were the color of a summer sky. "Show's over, folks," he called to the curious onlookers who'd gathered. "Go on back inside or head home." As the crowd dispersed, the stranger's gaze swept the street one last time and landed directly on Clara. She froze, caught in the open like a rabbit in a hunter's sights. For a long moment, neither moved. Then he nodded once, a simple acknowledgement before turning to go back inside. Clara's legs finally remembered how to work. She hurried toward the back entrance, her mind racing. Who was he? Not a local, that was certain. A drifter, probably. Just passing through like so many others before him. By next week, he'd be gone and forgotten. Little did Clara know that the stranger had just changed the course of her life forever. Inside the saloon, Mabel was waiting, arms crossed over her ample bosom. "You're late," she snapped, eyeing Clara's threadbare dress with disapproval. "And looking like that, you'll be lucky to get half what the men paid last time." Clara's cheeks burned with humiliation. "I'm sorry. Never mind," Mabel cut her off, already reaching for a pot of rouge. "We've got a full house tonight. That cattle drive from the south finally made it in, and those cowboys have been 3 weeks on the trail." Clara's stomach turned. Cowboys fresh off the trail were the worst, rough, demanding, and often cruel in their drunkenness. "I've got a room ready upstairs," Mabel continued, dabbing rouge onto Clara's pale cheeks. "Just remember our arrangement. Half to me, half to you. And no turning away paying customers, no matter what they look like or smell like." "Understood," Clara nodded numbly. She didn't trust her voice. "Good," Mabel said, stepping back to inspect her work. "Now try to smile, for God's sake. You look like you're at a funeral." Before Clara could respond, the door behind them opened, and a man in a suit that might have once been fine but was now shabby around the edges peered in. "Mabel," he said, his voice slurred with whiskey, "is this the new girl you mentioned? She's a pretty thing." Mabel's painted smile appeared. "Indeed she is, Mr. Holloway. And available if you've got the money." The man called Holloway leered at Clara, his bloodshot eyes traveling up and down her body in a way that made her skin crawl. He reached into his pocket and pulled out several coins, dropping them into Mabel's waiting palm. "She'll do nicely," he said, reaching for Clara's arm. Clara steeled herself, reminding herself of Emma's hungry eyes, of Thomas's thin shoulders. Just endure, she told herself. It will be over soon. But before Holloway could touch her, the door swung open again, and the tall stranger from the street stood framed in the doorway. "Pardon the interruption," he said, his voice deep and unhurried. His eyes moved from Mabel to Holloway, then settled on Clara's face. Not on her body like most men, but directly into her eyes. "I've got business to discuss with this lady." Holloway puffed up like an agitated toad. "Now see here." "I've already paid, here's your money back," the stranger said, tossing a small leather pouch that clinked heavily when Holloway caught it reflexively. "And a bit extra for the inconvenience." Holloway opened the pouch, his eyes widening at what he saw inside. Without another word, he pocketed it and slunk out. Mabel's painted eyebrows drew together in suspicion. "What kind of business, mister? Because if you're thinking of taking her elsewhere, our arrangement is exclusive to this establishment." The stranger removed his hat, revealing dark hair peppered with silver at the temples. "My name is Kieran Northrup," he said with a slight bow. "And my business is my own, madam, but I assure you your establishment will be fairly compensated for the lady's time." He reached into his coat and withdrew a roll of bills that made Mabel's eyes widen. He peeled off several and held them out. "This should cover tonight and perhaps a bit more." Mabel snatched the money, quickly counting it. Her expression softened considerably. "Well now, Mr. Northrup. That's mighty generous." She tucked the bills into her bodice and nodded to Clara. "Room at the top of the stairs, first door on the left. Take as much time as you need." Clara stood rooted to the spot, confusion and fear warring within her. Who was this man? What did he really want? And why had he intervened? As if reading her thoughts, Kieran Northrup said quietly, "I just want to talk, madam, nothing more." There was something in his eyes, a steadiness, a lack of the usual hunger she'd come to expect from men in this place that made Clara believe him, against her better judgment. "All right," she said softly, her first word since he'd entered. "Follow me, Mr. Northrup." The room at the top of the stairs was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single chair beside a window that looked out over Ardmore's Main Street. Clara entered first, immediately crossing to stand by the window, as far from the bed as possible. Kieran Northrup closed the door behind him but made no move to approach her. Instead, he set his hat on the small table and remained standing near the door. "I apologize for the intrusion, Mrs. Harlow," she supplied cautiously. "Clara Harlow," he nodded. "Mrs. Harlow, I'm not here to purchase your services." Clara's shoulders tightened. "Then why are you here, Mr. Northrup? And why pay Mabel all that money?" "Because I recognize the look in your eyes downstairs," he said simply. "It's not the look of a woman who chooses this life. It's the look of someone trapped with no other way out." Clara turned her face away, unable to bear the understanding in his gaze. "You don't know anything about me." "I know you have children," he said quietly. Her head snapped back toward him, alarm flaring. "How could you possibly? The way you hold yourself. The mending on your dress, small, neat stitches, the kind a mother makes. And there's a small wooden horse in your pocket. I saw the top of it when you were standing outside." Clara's hand instinctively went to her pocket, where she'd tucked Thomas's toy. She'd promised to bring it back after she'd fixed it. The leg had come loose, but hadn't had time before leaving. "You're very observant, Mr. Northrup," she said stiffly. "But my circumstances are my own concern." "Of course they are," he agreed readily. "And I'm not here to judge you, Mrs. Harlow, far from it. I'm here to offer you a different arrangement." Clara's eyes narrowed with suspicion. She'd heard different arrangements before, and they were usually worse than the straightforward transaction Mabel offered. As if sensing her thoughts, Kieran shook his head. "Not that kind of arrangement. A job. An honest one." Clara's heart skipped a beat, but she tamped down the flicker of hope. "What sort of job could you possibly offer me? I don't know you. You don't know me or my skills." "I know enough," he said. "I've recently purchased the old Murphy Ranch about 5 miles outside town. I'm turning it into a horse breeding operation. I need someone to cook and keep house, and before you say it, I know that's not much different from what many women endure in marriage. But I'm offering fair wages, room and board for you and your children, and my word as a gentleman that your virtue will never be in question." Clara stared at him, speechless. It sounded too good to be true, which meant it almost certainly was. "Why would you do this?" she finally asked. "You don't know me. You owe me nothing." Kieran Northrup's expression shifted, something like sadness passing across his features before he mastered it. "Let's just say I once knew someone in circumstances similar to yours," he said. "I wasn't in a position to help then. I am now." Clara studied him, trying to see past the confident exterior to the man beneath. There was pain there, she realized. Old pain, buried deep but still present. "I have 2 children," she said carefully. "Emma is 7, Thomas is 5. They're everything to me." "As they should be," he nodded. "There's plenty of room at the ranch. Fresh air, space to run. It would be good for children." "And what would my duties entail exactly?" "Cooking for myself and the 3 ranch hands I've hired. Keeping the main house in order, nothing beyond what any housekeeper would do." "And at night?" Clara asked bluntly. "What would you expect then?" To his credit, Kieran didn't flinch at the directness of her question. "At night, Mrs. Harlow, you and your children would retire to your own quarters, a small cabin about 50 yards from the main house. I've had it cleaned and repaired. It's modest but sound, with 2 rooms and a small kitchen of its own." Clara's mind raced. If he was telling the truth, this could be salvation for her and her children. No more hunger, no more shameful nights, no more lying to Emma and Thomas. But if he was lying, I would need to bring Mrs. Winters as well, she said suddenly, testing him. She's an elderly neighbor who helps with my children. I couldn't leave her behind. Kieran considered this, then nodded. The cabin is small, but we could make it work. Or there's a room off the kitchen in the main house that would suit an older woman. She could help with lighter duties if she wishes to earn her keep, but it's not necessary. Clara hadn't actually expected him to agree. Mrs. Winters had family in the next town who had been trying to convince her to move in with them for months. When would this job start? She asked, still cautious but increasingly hopeful. I'm heading back to the ranch at first light, he said. But I understand you might need time to arrange your affairs. I could return for you in 3 days. Clara thought of the bare cupboards at home, of Thomas's worsening cough, of the leaky roof that would make the coming winter unbearable. 3 more days in that shack seemed impossible. If the offer is genuine, she said slowly, I would prefer not to wait. My children and I could be ready by morning. Something like approval flickered in Kieran's eyes. Then I'll arrange for a wagon to pick you up at your home at 7 tomorrow morning. Where do you live? The small shack at the eastern edge of town, just past the blacksmith's. He nodded. I know it. He reached into his pocket and pulled out more money, more than Clara had seen in months. A small advance on your wages, for any supplies you might need before we leave. Clara stared at the offered money, her throat tight. Mr. Northrup, if this is some sort of trick. It's not, he said firmly. And you're free to change your mind at any point. I won't hold you to anything you don't freely choose. Something in his steady gaze, in the quiet dignity with which he held himself, made Clara reach out and take the money. Thank you, she whispered, the words inadequate for the lifeline he was offering. Kieran Northrup nodded once, retrieved his hat and moved toward the door. Until tomorrow, Mrs. Harlow. After he left, Clara sank onto the edge of the bed, the money clutched in her trembling hand. Was she being foolish? Naive? Or had God finally answered her desperate prayers? Only time would tell. But for the first time in months, Clara Harlow felt something she'd nearly forgotten existed. Hope. When Kieran's wagon pulled up outside Clara's shack the next morning, she was ready. It hadn't taken long to pack their meager possessions, a few clothes, Daniel's Bible, the children's handful of toys, and the quilt her mother had made for her wedding. Everything fit into one trunk and a carpet bag. Emma and Thomas stood beside her, wide-eyed and solemn in their best clothes, which weren't much better than their everyday ones. Clara had told them they were going to work on a ranch, where they'd have fresh air and maybe even see horses and cows. She hadn't mentioned the man who had made it possible, unsure herself what to make of Kieran Northrup. To her surprise, Kieran himself was driving the wagon, a solid farm wagon with a fresh coat of green paint, pulled by 2 matching bay horses that looked well-fed and strong. He wore simpler clothes than the night before, a blue work shirt, sturdy trousers and boots that had seen many miles. But he still carried himself with that same quiet confidence that had struck Clara from the first. He tipped his hat to her. Good morning, Mrs. Harlow. Good morning, Mr. Northrup, she replied, then gestured to the children. These are my children, Emma and Thomas. Children, this is Mr. Northrup. He owns the ranch where we'll be staying. Emma, always the more outgoing of the two, stepped forward with a small curtsy. Pleased to meet you, sir. Kieran's face softened as he addressed the little girl. The pleasure is mine, Miss Emma. He turned to the boy who was half hiding behind his mother's skirts. And you must be Thomas. I hear you're quite the brave young man. Thomas didn't respond but peered up at the tall stranger with wary interest. Clara was surprised by Kieran's gentle way with the children, Most men she knew barely acknowledged youngsters, especially those not their own. "Is this all your belongings?" Kieran asked, nodding toward the trunk and bag. "Yes," Clara said, trying not to feel embarrassed by how little they had. "We travel light." "That's a virtue on the frontier," Kieran said easily, lifting the trunk into the wagon as if it weighed nothing. He turned back to the children. "I've got something for you too, if your mother approves." He reached into his pocket and pulled out 2 small paper packages. "Peppermint sticks from the general store. For the journey." Clara hesitated only briefly before nodding her permission. The children's faces lit up as they accepted the treat's small luxuries they hadn't enjoyed since before their father died. "What do you say?" Clara prompted. "Thank you, sir," they chorused. Kieran smiled, the first real smile Clara had seen from him, and it transformed his face, softening the hard lines and bringing warmth to his blue eyes. "You're welcome. Now, shall we get started? It's about a 2-hour ride to the ranch, and I'd like to get there before the day gets too hot." He helped Clara up onto the wagon seat, then lifted each child up after her. Thomas, to Clara's surprise, allowed himself to be picked up without protest, usually shy around strangers. As they pulled away from the shack that had been their home for the past year, Clara didn't look back. There was nothing there to miss, except bad memories and harder times. The journey to the ranch passed more pleasantly than Clara had expected. Kieran pointed out landmarks along the way, telling Emma and Thomas about the different plants and animals they spotted. He had a natural way of explaining things to children without talking down to them, and soon even Thomas was asking questions in his small, serious voice. "Are there really horses at your ranch that we can see?" Emma asked, her peppermint stick long gone but the sweet smell still lingering. "There certainly are," Kieran replied. "Right now we have 12, including 2 new foals born just last month." "What's a foal?" Thomas wanted to know. "A baby horse," Kieran explained. "They're all legs and curiosity at this age. Perhaps your mother will allow you to help feed them carrots sometime." The children's excitement at this prospect was almost palpable, and Clara found herself smiling despite her lingering anxiety about what lay ahead. "Have you always worked with horses, Mr. Northrup?" she asked, genuinely curious about this man who had so unexpectedly altered their lives. A shadow seemed to pass over his face. "Not always, no. I spent some years doing other work, but horses have always been a passion. My father raised them in Kentucky before the war." "The war between the states?" Clara asked. He nodded. "He lost everything during those years, died trying to rebuild afterward." He said it matter-of-factly, but Clara sensed the old pain beneath the words. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. Kieran shrugged. "It was a long time ago. But horses are in my blood, I suppose. When I had saved enough to start over, this seemed the natural choice." "And what brought you to Oklahoma Territory?" Clara asked. "Good grazing land at prices I could afford," he said. "And a fresh start away from—" He trailed off, then finished simply, "away from the past." Clara understood that sentiment all too well. As they crested a small rise in the road, Kieran pointed ahead. "There it is. Murphy Ranch, though I suppose it's Northrup Ranch now." Clara followed his gesture and caught her breath. Spread out below them was a verdant valley, bisected by a creek lined with cottonwood trees. Nestled against a backdrop of rolling hills was a collection of buildings, a large 2-story farmhouse painted white, several outbuildings, corrals, and what looked like a newly constructed barn, its wood still raw and unweathered. "It's beautiful," she said softly, meaning it. "It needs work," Kieran admitted. "The previous owner let things slide in his later years, but the bones are good." As they drew closer, Clara could see what he meant. The house, while substantial, needed paint in places, and one of the outbuildings was listing slightly to one side. But there was order here too. The corrals were well maintained, the fences straight, and the yard swept clean. 3 men were visible as they pulled into the yard, one mending a fence, another carrying water buckets toward the horse corral, and a third splitting logs by the woodpile. All 3 stopped their work as the wagon approached. "Those are my hands," Kieran explained. "Good men, all of them. The big fellow by the corral is Hank Mason, my foreman. The one with the red beard is Patrick Doyle, and the young one at the woodpile is Billy Taylor." The men nodded respectfully as Kieran introduced them to Clara and the children. She was relieved to see they seemed decent, their manner respectful without the leering quality she'd grown to expect from men. "Mrs. Harlow will be our new housekeeper," Kieran informed them. "And these young people are Emma and Thomas." "Pleased to meet you, madam, children," Hank, the foreman, said with a tip of his hat. He was a barrel-chested man with a weathered face and kind eyes. "It'll be nice to have some proper cooking around here. Mr. Northrup tries his best, but—" He grimaced comically. "I never claimed to be a cook," Kieran said good-naturedly. "That's why Mrs. Harlow is here." Clara felt some of her tension ease at the easy camaraderie between Kieran and his men. Whatever else might be uncertain about this arrangement, it seemed she'd be working among people who respected each other. "Let me show you to your cabin," Kieran said, helping Clara down from the wagon. "Hank, would you bring Mrs. Harlow's trunk?" "Of course, boss." As they walked toward a small cabin set back from the main house, Kieran explained, "We use this as a guest cabin when buyers come to look at horses, but it's yours now. I had the men fix it up last week. New roof, fresh whitewash, glass in the windows." The cabin was small but sturdy, with a covered porch across the front and a stone chimney at one end. Inside, Clara found a main room with a fireplace, a small kitchen area with a cast iron stove, a table, and 4 chairs. A doorway led to a bedroom with a double bed and a smaller trundle that could be pulled out. "It's not fancy," Kieran said, suddenly looking almost nervous, "but it's sound. No leaks even in the heaviest rain." "It's perfect," Clara said honestly, running her hand over the smooth, plain table. "Better than anywhere we've lived in a long time." Hank brought in the trunk, setting it carefully by the wall. "Anything else you need, madam?" "No, thank you," Clara replied. "This is very kind." After Hank left, Kieran cleared his throat. "I'll leave you and the children to get settled. There's no hurry about starting your duties. Take today to rest. I've stocked the pantry with some basics. We usually eat dinner, the midday meal at noon in the main house, and supper at 6. But join us when you're ready." Clara nodded, overwhelmed by his consideration. "Thank you, Mr. Northrup, for everything." He looked as if he wanted to say something more, but instead just nodded. "Welcome to the ranch, Mrs. Harlow." With a tip of his hat, he was gone. Emma and Thomas immediately began exploring their new home, exclaiming over luxuries. Clara had once taken for granted a real cookstove, glass windows, a watertight roof. Clara opened the small pantry and nearly wept at what she found. Flour, sugar, coffee, beans, rice, salt pork, preserves, even a tin of hard candies. Food enough for weeks when they'd been living day to day for so long. As she stood there, a sound from outside caught her attention. She moved to the window and saw Kieran in the nearby corral, working with a young horse. His movements were sure and gentle as he spoke to the animal, his body language confident without being threatening. Clara watched, mesmerized, as he slowly gained the horse's trust, eventually running his hand down its neck in a soothing gesture. There was patience in his movements, and kindness, qualities she hadn't often seen in the men she'd known. For the first time, she allowed herself to truly hope that perhaps, Against all odds, Kieran Northrup was exactly what he appeared to be. A good man offering them a chance at a better life. That hope, fragile as a newly kindled flame, warmed her as she turned back to her children and their new beginning. The first week at Northrup Ranch passed in a blur of adjustment and discovery for Clara and her children. True to his word, Kieran had been nothing but respectful, treating Clara like the housekeeper she was no more, no less. Clara took to her duties with determination. The main house was spacious but had clearly been neglected. She attacked the dust and cobwebs with vigor, sorting through the kitchen to see what was usable and what wasn't. By the end of the week, the downstairs rooms gleamed, smelling of beeswax polish and fresh baked bread. The men, for their part, seemed genuinely appreciative of her cooking after months of their own haphazard efforts. Even simple meals of beans, cornbread, and salt pork were received with enthusiasm that made Clara feel valued in a way she hadn't in a long time. Emma and Thomas blossomed in their new surroundings. With good food, fresh air, and the security of a sound roof over their heads, they quickly regained the childhood exuberance that hardship had dampened. Thomas's cough improved dramatically, and Emma's serious little face softened with more frequent smiles. Kieran, Clara noticed, made time each day to engage with the children, despite his busy schedule. He showed Thomas how to whittle simple shapes from soft pine, and taught Emma the names and purposes of the various tools in the barn. He answered their endless questions with patience, never making them feel like nuisances. On the Saturday of their first week, Clara was startled by a knock at the cabin door just after breakfast. She opened it to find Kieran standing there, hat in hand. "Good morning, Mrs. Harlow," he said. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all," Clara replied, wiping her hands on her apron. "The children and I were just finishing breakfast. I was wondering if they might like to see those foals I mentioned," he said. "If you approve, of course." Before Clara could respond, Emma appeared at her side, eyes wide with excitement. "Oh, Mama, please, can we see the baby horses?" Thomas wasn't far behind, his usual shyness forgotten in the face of such an opportunity. Clara couldn't help but smile at their enthusiasm. "I suppose that would be all right, if Mr. Northrup doesn't mind." "I wouldn't have offered if I minded," Kieran said with a slight smile. "In fact, I was hoping you might join us, Mrs. Harlow. It's a fine morning for a walk around the ranch, and you've been working hard all week." Clara hesitated. She wasn't used to taking time for herself, and the idea of being in Kieran's company outside of her duties made her slightly nervous. Not because she feared him, that concern had faded with each respectful interaction, but because of the strange, fluttering sensation she felt whenever he was near. "I should finish the washing," she began. "The washing can wait," Kieran said firmly. "You've earned a break, Mrs. Harlow. And I thought it might be good for you to see more of the ranch, since it's your home now, too." Home. The word resonated in Clara's heart. This place was becoming that against all odds. "All right," she conceded. "Let me just get my shawl." The tour began at the horse corrals, where Kieran introduced them to his prized breeding stock, a magnificent black stallion named Midnight, several elegant mares, and to the children's delight, two wobbly-legged foals that sniffed curiously at their outstretched hands. "This one's called Star," Kieran said, nodding to a chestnut foal with a white blaze. "And the darker one is Shadow." "They're beautiful," Clara said, genuinely impressed by the quality of the animals. Even with her limited knowledge, she could see these were exceptional horses. "They're the future of this ranch," Kieran said, a note of pride in his voice. "Good breeding stock brings good prices, and there's always a market for quality horses, especially with the army." From the corrals, They walked to the creek that ran through the property, where Kieran pointed out a deep swimming hole that would be perfect for hot summer days. "Can we swim there, Mama?" Emma asked excitedly. "Perhaps when the weather's warmer," Clara said, though the truth was neither child had learned to swim. Daniel had always meant to teach them, but there had never been time. As if reading her thoughts, Kieran said, "I could teach them come summer, if you'd allow it." "Every child should know how to swim." "That's very kind," Clara said, surprised by the offer. "Thank you." They continued their walk, with Kieran pointing out the boundaries of the ranch, the best fishing spots, and a grove of apple trees that would bear fruit in the fall. "I'm planning to expand," he explained as they paused on a rise overlooking the property. "Another 100 acres to the east would give us better grazing and access to more water." "It's already a fine spread," Clara observed. "You've accomplished a lot in a short time." Kieran's expression turned thoughtful. "I spent years saving for this, did a lot of things I'm not proud of to get here." At her curious look, he added, "I was a bounty hunter for a while, tracked men who needed catching for the rewards." "That's honest work," Clara said carefully, sensing there was more to the story. "Honest, maybe, but it changes a man hunting other men." He shook his head as if to dispel unwelcome memories. "Anyway, that's behind me now. This ranch is my future, a place to put down roots." Clara understood the yearning in his voice all too well. After years of uncertainty, of never knowing where the next meal would come from, the idea of roots, of permanence, was powerfully appealing. They made their way back toward the main house, the children running ahead to chase a butterfly that had caught their attention. "They seem happier," Kieran observed. "More like children should be." "They are," Clara agreed. "This past week has been—" She struggled to find words adequate to express the transformation in their lives. "I don't know how to thank you properly, Mr. Northrup." "You already have," he said simply. "You've brought life back to this house. Good food, clean rooms, the sound of children's laughter. It's payment enough." Clara glanced at him, struck by the sincerity in his voice. In that moment, with the morning sun highlighting the silver at his temples and the tiny lines around his eyes, she thought he looked less like the hard man who had intervened at the saloon, and more like someone who had found his own kind of peace. The thought warmed her unexpectedly, and she quickly looked away, focusing instead on her children as they darted among the wildflowers. "Mrs. Harlow," Kieran said after a moment, his tone more formal, "there's something I've been meaning to discuss with you." Clara tensed, old fears stirring. Was this when the other shoe would drop? When he would reveal some hidden expectation or condition? "I ride into town every Saturday afternoon for supplies," he continued. "I thought perhaps you and the children might like to accompany me today. You might need things I haven't thought to provide, and the children might enjoy a trip to the general store." Relief washed through Clara, followed by a pang of shame for having doubted him, even momentarily. "That would be lovely," she said. "The children would certainly enjoy it." "Good," he nodded, seeming pleased. "We'll leave after dinner then." As they continued toward the house, Clara found herself studying Kieran's profile, trying to reconcile the gunman from the saloon with this thoughtful rancher who noticed children's needs and worried about her comfort. Which was the real Kieran Northrup? Perhaps, she was beginning to think, they both were different facets of a complex man shaped by experiences she could only guess at. And for the first time, Clara realized she wanted to know more. The trip to Ardmore that afternoon marked another significant shift in Clara's relationship with her new employer. As they rode into town in Kieran's wagon, Clara was acutely aware of how different this journey was from her last desperate visits. Then, she had slipped in after dark, head down, avoiding eye contact, her heart heavy with shame. Now she sat beside Kieran in broad daylight, her children between them, their faces bright with anticipation of the promised candy sticks from the general store. When they passed the dusty boot saloon, Clara tensed involuntarily. Kieran, noticing her discomfort, subtly guided the horses to the opposite side of the street, positioning himself between Clara and the establishment that held such dark memories. The small gesture of understanding touched Clara deeply. He hadn't mentioned her past since that first night, had never once made her feel judged for the choices desperation had forced upon her. At the general store, Kieran helped Clara down from the wagon, then lifted each child with an ease that spoke of his strength. Inside, he addressed the storekeeper with the confidence of a valued customer. "Afternoon, Mr. Garfield. I've brought Mrs. Harlow and her children to do some shopping. Whatever they need, put it on my account." The storekeeper's eyes widened slightly as he recognized Clara, but at Kieran's steady gaze he merely nodded. "Of course, Mr. Northrup. Mrs. Harlow, how can I help you today?" Clara, conscious of the curious glances from other customers, straightened her shoulders. "We need some fabric for new clothes, if you please. And thread." As she selected sturdy cotton for shirts and dresses, Kieran disappeared to handle his own business. He returned as Clara was examining a bolt of soft blue calico, far prettier than the practical browns and grays she'd selected. "That would suit you," he commented, noticing her interest in the fabric. "It matches your eyes." Clara blushed at the unexpected compliment, quickly setting the bolt aside. "It's too fine for everyday wear." "Perhaps, but everyone needs something special now and then," Kieran said. He turned to the storekeeper. "Add 3 yards of the blue calico to our order, Mr. Garfield." "Mr. Northrup, that's not necessary," Clara began. "Consider it a welcome gift," he said quietly. "You deserve something pretty, Mrs. Harlow." Before she could argue further, Emma appeared at her side, eyes wide with wonder. "Mama, look, real paper dolls." She held up a small book of cut-out dolls with various paper outfits. "And candy sticks," Thomas added hopefully, pointing to the glass jars on the counter. Clara looked to Kieran, uncertain about these additional expenses. "The candy I promised them," he said with a smile. "And the paper dolls seem a small thing to bring such joy." As they continued shopping, Clara became aware of whispers among the other customers. She caught fragments: "Northrup's new housekeeper," and "Those are the Harlow children." One woman, whom Clara recognized as the banker's wife, approached them at the counter. "Mrs. Harlow," she said, her voice cool but not unkind. "I heard you'd found a position. How fortunate." Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks, but before she could respond, Kieran stepped closer, his presence solid and reassuring at her side. "Mrs. Harlow is an excellent housekeeper and a fine cook," he said, his tone pleasant but with an undercurrent of steel. "My ranch has benefited greatly from her presence." The banker's wife blinked, clearly taken aback by Kieran's direct defense. "I'm sure it has," she murmured before hurrying away. As they loaded their purchases into the wagon, Clara found her voice. "You didn't have to do that." "Do what?" Kieran asked, securing the last bundle. "Defend me. Stand up for me like that." He turned to face her, his expression serious. "Mrs. Harlow, Clara, I meant every word. You've brought order and comfort to my home in just 1 week. Your worth isn't determined by gossip or past hardships." Clara looked down, overwhelmed by his conviction. "People in town, they know what I did, what I was." "What circumstances forced upon you," Kieran corrected gently. "And anyone who judges you for surviving however you could to feed your children isn't worth your concern." He helped the children into the wagon, then offered his hand to Clara. As she took it, feeling the strength and warmth of his grip, something shifted in her heart, a wall beginning to crumble. On the ride home, with the children chattering excitedly about their treasures, Clara stole glances at Kieran's profile, struck by how natural it felt to be beside him, how safe she felt in his presence. It was a dangerous feeling, she knew. He was her employer, nothing more. And she had sworn after Daniel's death that she would never again put her fate in a man's hands. Independence, hard-won though it was, seemed safer than risking her heart. Yet as the wagon rolled toward the ranch, the setting sun painting the prairie gold, Clara couldn't deny the small, persistent voice inside her that whispered, "What if the seasons turned, summer heat giving way to the golden days of early autumn?" 3 months had passed since Clara and her children had come to Northrup Ranch, and the transformation in their lives was remarkable. Emma and Thomas had filled out, their once gaunt faces now round with good health, their skin tanned from days spent playing in the fresh air. Emma had started learning her letters from books Kieran brought her from town, while Thomas had become the self-appointed helper of Billy, the youngest ranch hand, trailing after him with solemn devotion. Clara, too, had changed. Good food and rest had restored curves to her once thin frame, and the constant fear that had been her companion for so long had faded, replaced by a growing confidence in her place at the ranch. The main house had undergone its own transformation under her care. What had been a bachelor's sparse dwelling was now a proper home, with curtains at the windows, braided rugs on the floors, and the constant aroma of good cooking filling the rooms. Kieran had noted the changes with quiet approval, often pausing in the doorway of a freshly arranged room to comment on the improvement. His appreciation, expressed in that straightforward way of his, never failed to bring a flush of pleasure to Clara's cheeks. Their relationship had developed into something Clara couldn't quite define. He was still her employer, still unfailingly respectful of the boundaries between them. Yet there was an ease in their interactions now, a comfort in each other's presence that went beyond the formal roles they occupied. They had fallen into a routine of taking coffee together in the quiet hour after supper, when the children were settled in the cabin and the ranch hands had retired to their bunkhouse. Sometimes they discussed practical matters, supplies needed or repairs to be made. Other times, they simply talked, sharing fragments of their lives before they had met. Clara learned that Kieran had indeed been born in Kentucky, the son of a prosperous horse breeder whose fortunes had been destroyed by the war. After his father's death, Kieran had drifted west, taking whatever work he could find: cowhand, freight driver, and eventually, bounty hunter. "It was a dark time in my life," he admitted one evening as they sat on the main house's porch, watching the sunset paint the hills. "I was good with a gun, and there was money in bringing in men with prices on their heads. But it changed me, hardened me in ways I didn't like." "What made you stop?" Clara asked, drawn into his story despite herself. Kieran was silent for a long moment, staring out at the deepening shadows. "I tracked a man into Colorado. He'd killed a banker during a robbery gone wrong, at least according to the wanted poster. When I found him, he was working as a schoolteacher in a small town, married with a young son." He took a sip of his coffee before continuing. "I watched him for 3 days before making my move, saw him with his family, teaching children, living an honest life. When I finally confronted him, he didn't deny his past, said he'd been young and stupid, fallen in with bad company. The robbery wasn't supposed to involve violence, but his partner had panicked and shot the banker." "What did you do?" Clara asked softly. "My job," Kieran said, his voice flat. "I brought him in, got my reward. And then I watched as they hanged a man who'd spent the last 5 years trying to make amends, to be better than his worst mistake." He shook his head. His wife was left alone with their son, much like you were left with Emma and Thomas. That night, I walked away from bounty hunting for good." Clara was silent, absorbing the weight of his confession. She understood now something of the shadows that sometimes crossed his face, the burden of regret he carried. "We all have things in our past we wish we could change," she said finally. "Actions taken or not taken that we have to live with." Kieran looked at her then, his blue eyes intent in the fading light. "Yes," he said quietly, "but it's what we do afterward that matters most, I think, how we try to balance the scales." The conversation stayed with Clara long after she had returned to her cabin that night. She recognized in Kieran's story echoes of her own journey, different circumstances, but the same struggle to reconcile past actions with present redemption. It was this understanding, this shared experience of having walked through fire and emerged changed but not destroyed, that drew her to him more powerfully than mere attraction could explain. As autumn deepened, bringing the first crisp nights and early frosts, Clara found herself looking forward to their evening talks with an anticipation that both thrilled and frightened her. It had been so long since she had allowed herself to want anything beyond mere survival, and the flutter of hope in her heart felt dangerously vulnerable. One evening in late October, as Clara was preparing supper in the main house kitchen, a commotion outside drew her attention. She wiped her hands on her apron and moved to the window in time to see Kieran and Hank struggling to control a magnificent black horse she didn't recognize. The animal was wild-eyed with fear or rage, rearing and striking out with powerful hooves. As she watched, it suddenly lunged sideways, knocking Hank off his feet. Kieran moved quickly, placing himself between the fallen man and the dangerous hooves, but in doing so, he lost his grip on the lead rope. The horse reared again, its front legs pawing the air just inches from Kieran's head. Clara gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as the animal came down, one hoof striking Kieran's shoulder with enough force to send him stumbling backward. Without thinking, Clara rushed outside, her heart pounding with fear. By the time she reached the corral, Patrick and Billy had arrived to help, and between them they had managed to secure the horse to a sturdy post. "Kieran," Clara called, forgetting in her concern the formal Mr. Northrup she usually used. "Are you hurt?" He turned at her voice, one hand gripping his right shoulder. His face was pale beneath his tan, but he managed a tight smile. "It's nothing serious," he said, though the grimace that followed betrayed his pain. "Just a glancing blow." "Let me see," Clara insisted, reaching for him. "The new stallion needs to be settled first," he protested. "He's still half wild from the journey." "Hank and the boys can handle that," Clara said firmly. "You need to have that shoulder looked at." Perhaps it was the pain, or perhaps it was the unusual note of authority in her voice, but Kieran allowed himself to be led to the house without further argument. In the kitchen, Clara helped him remove his jacket, wincing at his sharp intake of breath when she eased it over his injured shoulder. "You'll need to take off your shirt as well," she said, keeping her voice professional despite the flutter in her stomach at the thought. "I can't assess the damage otherwise." Kieran hesitated only briefly before beginning to unbutton his shirt with his left hand. Seeing his difficulty, Clara stepped forward. "Let me," she said softly. Their eyes met for a long moment before Kieran nodded, dropping his hand to his side. Clara worked quickly, her fingers only slightly trembling as she undid each button, then carefully helped him shrug out of the garment. She had seen shirtless men before her husband, of course, and later, the men she had been forced by circumstances to service at the Dusty Boot. But none had affected her as Kieran did now, with his broad chest and strong arms covered in a light dusting of dark hair. A map of old scars told the story of a hard life lived dangerously, But it was the fresh injury that drew her attention, an angry red mark already darkening to purple across his right shoulder. "You're lucky it wasn't worse," she said, gently probing the area. "I don't think anything's broken, but you'll have a significant bruise." "I've had worse," Kieran said, his voice oddly husky. Clara glanced up to find him watching her, his blue eyes dark with an emotion she couldn't quite name, or perhaps was afraid to name. She stepped back, suddenly aware of their proximity, of the intimacy of the moment. "I'll make a poultice to draw out the bruising, and you should rest that arm for a day or two." "I have a ranch to run," he objected mildly. "And capable hands to help you," Clara countered. "Don't be stubborn, Mr. Northrup." A corner of his mouth lifted. "You called me Kieran before." Clara felt heat rise to her cheeks. I was concerned." "I liked it," he said simply. "Would it be so difficult to use my given name?" The question seemed weighted with more significance than the simple words suggested. "I suppose not." "Kieran," Clara said, testing the feel of his name on her lips. His smile widened, transforming his face despite the pain he must still be feeling. "Thank you, Clara." She busied herself gathering herbs for the poultice, acutely conscious of his presence, of his gaze following her movements. When she returned to his side with the prepared mixture, her hands were steady, but her pulse was not. As she applied the poultice to his bruised shoulder, her fingers moving gently over his skin, Kieran spoke again. "That new stallion is a risk," he said, apparently needing to fill the charged silence between them. "But if I can gentle him, breed him with our mares, he could elevate the entire bloodline of our stock." Clara noted his use of "our," as if the ranch were somehow a shared enterprise. "He seems very wild," she observed. "He is. But the wildness is part of his value. Spirit, strength, endurance, all traits I want in our horses." Kieran winced slightly as she pressed the poultice more firmly against the bruise. "The trick is to channel that spirit, not break it." "Is that possible? To tame something so wild without destroying what makes it special?" Kieran's eyes met hers, and Clara had the distinct impression they were no longer talking about horses. "It is," he said softly, "with patience, with trust, with the understanding that freedom and partnership aren't mutually exclusive." Clara's hand stilled on his shoulder, her heart beating a rapid rhythm against her ribs. There was meaning here beyond the words, an invitation in his steady gaze that both tempted and terrified her. "I should bandage this," she said, retreating to safer ground, "to hold the poultice in place." As she wound the clean strips of linen around his shoulder and chest, Clara was intensely aware of his breathing, of the warmth of his skin beneath her fingers, of the strange tension that had sprung up between them as if they stood on the edge of some precipice, one step away from falling. When she finished, Kieran caught her hand in his before she could step away. "Thank you," he said, his voice low, "for taking care of me." "It's part of my duties," Clara replied, though they both knew that wasn't entirely true. "Is that all it is?" Kieran asked, his gaze holding hers. Clara found she couldn't lie, not to him, not in this moment. "No," she whispered. "It's not all." Something like triumph flashed in his eyes, quickly replaced by a gentler emotion. He raised her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles with a reverence that made her breath catch. "Good," he said simply. "Because I'd very much like to court you properly, Clara Harlow, if you'd allow it." The words, spoken with such straightforward honesty, stole Clara's voice. She had known, somewhere deep inside, that their relationship was changing, evolving beyond employer and employee. But to hear it stated so plainly, to have her own confused feelings mirrored in his declaration, was overwhelming. I don't know what to say," she admitted. "You don't have to say anything right now," Kieran assured her, still holding her hand. "I know this is unexpected. I know you have your children to think of, and that your past experiences might make you cautious. I'm asking for the chance to show you that my intentions are honorable, that what I feel for you is real and lasting." Clara looked into his face, searching for any sign of deception or ulterior motive. She found none, only the open sincerity that had been Kieran's hallmark from the beginning. "I need time," she said finally. "To think, to be sure," he nodded, releasing her hand reluctantly. "Of course. Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere, Clara." As she helped him back into his shirt, her mind whirled with conflicting emotions: hope, fear, longing, doubt. The life she had built here with her children was precious, stable in a way they hadn't known for too long. Was it worth risking for the uncertain territory of love? Yet as she watched Kieran walk carefully back outside, moving with the deliberate steps of a man in pain trying not to show it, Clara acknowledged the truth she had been avoiding for weeks. She was already falling for Kieran Northrup, had been since that first night when he had offered her a different path. The only question now was whether she had the courage to follow where that path might lead. The weeks following Kieran's declaration brought a subtle shift in the rhythm of life at Northrup Ranch. True to his word, Kieran made no demands, applied no pressure. Yet there was a new awareness between them, an unspoken acknowledgement of possibilities hovering just beyond the present moment. Clara noticed small changes in his behavior: a wildflower left on the kitchen table in the morning, an extra log already laid in her cabin's fireplace when the first real cold snap arrived, his hand lingering just a moment longer than necessary when helping her down from the wagon after their weekly trips to town. Each gesture spoke of consideration rather than possession, of respect rather than presumption. He was courting her as he had promised, with a patient persistence that gradually wore away at her reservations. The children, sensitive to the shifting currents between the adults, watched with curious eyes. Emma, old beyond her years in some ways, observed Kieran's attentions to her mother with thoughtful calculation. Thomas, simpler in his assessments, simply accepted that Kieran had become a fixture in their lives, someone to trust and admire. One evening in early November, Kieran invited Clara and the children to join him for supper in the main house, not the usual working meal shared with the ranch hands, but a special occasion just for the four of them. "I thought we might celebrate a bit," he explained when Clara questioned the reason. "It's been exactly 4 months since you arrived at the ranch." Clara was touched that he had remembered the date. "That's very thoughtful," she said, "but you don't need to go to any trouble." "It's no trouble," Kieran assured her. "I've asked Hank's wife Mary to help with the cooking when she comes tomorrow to deliver eggs. All you need to do is enjoy yourself." The invitation created a flutter of anticipation Clara hadn't felt in years. That evening, she took special care with her appearance, wearing the blue calico dress Kieran had insisted on buying that first day in town. She brushed her hair until it shone, twisting it into a simple but elegant knot at the nape of her neck. Emma watched her preparations with wide eyes. "You look so pretty, Mama," she said. "Like a princess in my storybook." Clara laughed, touched by her daughter's wonder. "Hardly a princess, sweetheart, but it's nice to dress up sometimes, isn't it?" When they arrived at the main house, Clara was surprised to find the dining room transformed. The plain wooden table was covered with a white cloth she recognized from the linen closet she had organized months ago. Candles provided a warm, flickering light, and wildflowers arranged in a blue jar served as a centerpiece. Kieran greeted them at the door, dressed in his best shirt and a vest she'd never seen before. His eyes widened appreciatively at the sight of Clara in the blue dress. "You look beautiful," he said simply. Clara felt a blush warm her cheeks. "Thank you. This is all so lovely." I wanted it to be special, Kieran said, ushering them inside. He bent down to the children's level. And don't you two look fine as well? Emma, that ribbon in your hair matches your mama's dress. And Thomas, I do believe you've grown another inch since last week. The children beamed under his attention. Clara noticed that Kieran had set the table with his best dishes, not fine china by any means, but a matched set she had found in a cabinet and cleaned for special occasions. The meal itself was simple but well-prepared roast chicken, potatoes with rosemary, fresh bread, and for dessert, an apple pie that Clara suspected had come from the baker in town. Throughout the meal, Kieran kept the conversation flowing, telling stories that made the children laugh and asking them about their days in a way that made them feel important and heard. Clara watched him with her children, seeing how naturally he interacted with them, how genuinely he seemed to care about their thoughts and experiences. After dessert, Kieran surprised them again by producing a small gift for each child: a wooden horse he had carved himself for Thomas, and a small book of poetry for Emma. "Mr. Northrup," Clara protested softly. "This is too much." "Not at all," he replied. "It gives me joy to see them happy." Later, after the children had been tucked into bed in the cabin, Kieran walked Clara back through the crisp night air. Stars blazed overhead in the clear November sky, and their breath formed small clouds in the chilly air. "Thank you for tonight," Clara said as they reached her porch. "It was wonderful." "I'm glad you enjoyed it," Kieran said. He hesitated, then added, "Clara, I know I said I'd give you time, and I mean to keep that promise. But I hope tonight showed you something of what could be not just for you and me, but for all of us as a family." The word family hung in the air between them, loaded with meaning and possibility. "My children adore you," Clara acknowledged. "That much is clear." "And what about their mother?" Kieran asked quietly. "Have I made any progress there?" Clara looked up into his face, so earnest in the starlight. The truth was, he had made tremendous progress, had, in fact, already won her heart with his steady kindness, his integrity, his gentle strength. But admitting it aloud seemed like such a momentous step, a commitment she wasn't sure she was ready to make. "You've given me much to think about," she said finally. Kieran nodded, accepting her caution without resentment. "I can be a patient man when something's worth waiting for," he said. Then, with exquisite care, he took her hand and raised it to his lips, his eyes never leaving hers. "Good night, Clara." As he walked away toward the main house, Clara remained on her porch, her hand still warm from his kiss, her heart beating an unfamiliar rhythm of hope and possibility. Inside, she found Emma still awake, sitting up in the bed she shared with Thomas. "Mama," she whispered, careful not to wake her brother, "does Mr. Northrup want to marry you?" The directness of the question caught Clara off guard. "What makes you ask that, sweetheart?" Emma gave her a look of childish exasperation. "He looks at you the way Pa used to, and he gave us presents and made everything so nice tonight." Clara sat on the edge of the bed, smoothing her daughter's hair. "Would it bother you if he did?" Emma considered this seriously. "No," she said finally. "He's nice and strong, and he makes you smile. You didn't smile much after Pa died." The simple observation, delivered with a child's unvarnished honesty, struck Clara to the heart. It was true. Grief and hardship had stolen her smiles, had forced her to become so focused on survival that joy had seemed an unaffordable luxury. Until Kieran. "He does make me smile," Clara admitted softly. "Then you should marry him," Emma said, as if it were the most obvious conclusion in the world. "Thomas thinks so too." Clara kissed her daughter's forehead. "It's not quite that simple, sweetheart." "Why not?" Emma persisted. "Don't you like him?" "Yes," Clara whispered. "I like him very much." "And he likes you and us." Emma yawned, her eyelids growing heavy. "Seems simple to me." Clara tucked the blankets around her daughter, marveling at the wisdom sometimes found in childish simplicity. Perhaps Emma was right. Perhaps she was making things more complicated than they needed to be, allowing old fears and doubts to cloud what her heart already knew. As she prepared for bed herself, Clara found her thoughts returning to the evening, the warmth in Kieran's eyes when he looked at her, the natural way he engaged with her children, the care he had taken to make the night special. Was she being overly cautious, denying herself and her children the chance at a complete family again? The question followed her into her dreams, where Daniel's face blended with Kieran's, past and possible future merging in a way that felt not like betrayal, but like the natural progression of a life still being lived. Winter descended on the Oklahoma Territory with a vengeance that year. December brought heavy snow and bitter winds that howled around the corners of buildings, and drove even the hardiest ranch hands to seek shelter earlier than usual each evening. For Clara, the cold weather meant more work, extra washing as the men rotated through more clothes, heartier meals to combat the chill, constant battling against drafts and dampness in both the main house and her cabin. Yet despite the added labor, she found herself happier than she had been in years. The ranch felt like home now, and the people in it like family, not just her children, but Kieran, and even the ranch hands with their rough manners but kind hearts. A week before Christmas, a package arrived from Ardmore for Clara. Kieran brought it to her cabin himself, his cheeks ruddy from the cold ride into town. "Special delivery," he announced, stomping snow from his boots before entering. He handed her a brown paper parcel tied with string. "This came for you at the post office." Clara took the package with surprise. "For me? I wasn't expecting anything." "Open it," Kieran encouraged, his eyes warm with interest. Clara untied the string and carefully unwrapped the paper to reveal several lengths of fabric, one of rich green wool, another of cream-colored cotton, and a third of red and green plaid flannel. Beneath the fabric was a small note in familiar handwriting. "It's from my sister in Kansas City," Clara explained, reading the note quickly. "She writes that she's finally doing well enough to send us a Christmas gift." She touched the wool reverently. "This is fine material. There's enough here for new winter dresses for Emma and me, and shirts for Thomas." Kieran smiled at her obvious pleasure. "That's wonderful, Clara. Your sister must care for you very much." "She does," Clara agreed. "We lost touch after Daniel died. I was too ashamed to tell her how bad things had gotten. But I wrote to her a month ago, telling her where we were, that we were doing well." She looked up at Kieran, her eyes bright with emotion. "Thanks to you," he shook his head. "You've earned everything you have here, Clara. Never doubt that." She began carefully refolding the fabric. "With this, and what I've saved from my wages, I can get proper Christmas gifts for the children. They haven't had a real Christmas since Daniel died." "Speaking of Christmas," Kieran said, "I was hoping you and the children might join me at the main house for the holiday. The Hands are all visiting family, so it would just be us." Clara looked up at him, noting the slight uncertainty in his expression. Despite all they had shared over the past months, despite the growing closeness between them, he still approached her with a care that spoke of his respect for her independence. "We'd be honored," she said softly. His face brightened. "Excellent. I thought perhaps we could cut a tree from that stand of pines near the creek. The children might enjoy decorating it." "They would love that," Clara agreed. "Emma's been telling Thomas about Christmas trees, but I wasn't sure how we'd manage one in the cabin." "The main house has plenty of room," Kieran said, "and I'd like to see it filled with Christmas cheer for once. It's been a long time since I celebrated properly." Clara heard the loneliness behind the words, the years of solitary Christmases he didn't need to describe. "Then we have a date, Mr. Northrup," she said lightly. His eyes caught hers, warm and intent. "Indeed we do, Mrs. Harlow." The days leading up to Christmas took on a festive air despite the continuing cold. True to his word, Kieran took Clara and the children to select a pine tree, which they installed in the corner of the main house's parlor. Emma and Thomas spent hours creating decorations, paper chains, strings of dried berries, small figures cut from scraps of fabric and stuffed with cotton. Clara, working late into the evenings after the children were asleep, sewed new clothes from her sister's gift, a green wool dress for Emma, a shirt for Thomas, and with the cream cotton, a special surprise for Kieran. On Christmas Eve, a brief break in the weather allowed them to attend services in Ardmore's small church. Clara, sitting beside Kieran in the pew with her children between them, was struck by how much they resembled a normal family, a husband and wife with their children, gathered to celebrate the holy day. The thought should have alarmed her, she knew. Instead, it filled her with a quiet joy, a sense of rightness that had been building since the night of Kieran's declaration. After the service, several townspeople approached them, offering holiday greetings with a warmth Clara hadn't experienced during her darkest days in Ardmore. She noticed how they addressed Kieran with respect, how they included her naturally in the conversation, as if her position as his housekeeper were merely a technicality, as if they already considered her something more. Perhaps they did. Perhaps the entire town had seen what Clara had been slow to admit to herself: that she and Kieran belonged together, that what had begun as an act of charity had transformed into something deeper, more lasting. That night, after returning to the ranch and settling the exhausted children into their beds in the cabin, Clara joined Kieran on the porch of the main house. The sky had cleared, revealing a canopy of stars that seemed close enough to touch in the crisp winter air. "It was a lovely service," Clara said, drawing her shawl more tightly around her shoulders. "It was," Kieran agreed, "though I must confess I was more focused on the beautiful woman beside me than on Reverend Miller's sermon." Clara felt her cheeks warm despite the cold. "You shouldn't say such things." "Why not?" Kieran asked softly. "It's the truth. You are beautiful tonight, Clara. You are beautiful inside and out." He moved closer, his tall form blocking the wind that had begun to pick up again. "I've kept my promise," he said. "I've given you time. I've tried to show you rather than just tell you what you mean to me. But tonight, watching you in the church, seeing you with the children, looking so right, so perfect, I find I can't wait any longer." From his pocket, he withdrew a small box. "I bought this in Kansas City last month. I've been carrying it everywhere, waiting for the right moment." He opened the box to reveal a simple gold band set with a small, perfect pearl. "It's not diamonds or rubies," he said apologetically, "but pearls are rare and precious, formed through adversity into something beautiful like you." Clara stared at the ring, her heart hammering in her chest. "Kieran." "I love you, Clara Harlow," he said, his voice steady and sure. "I want to spend my life with you, to raise those wonderful children with you, to build something lasting together. Will you marry me?" The question hung in the frosty air between them, momentous and life-changing. Clara looked up into Kieran's face, the face that had become so dear to her, with its lines of experience and kindness, its steadfast blue eyes that had never looked at her with anything but respect and growing affection. She thought of all they had shared these past months, not just the work and responsibilities of the ranch, but the quiet conversations, the gradual revealing of themselves to each other, the trust that had grown between them. She thought of how he treated her children, with a perfect balance of authority and tenderness. She thought of the future stretching before them, not easy, perhaps, but full of possibility. And she thought of her fears that love wouldn't be enough, that hardship would return, that she would lose herself in becoming a wife again. But those fears seemed insubstantial now, like shadows that couldn't withstand the light of what she and Kieran had built together. "Yes," she said, her voice clear in the still night. "Yes, I will marry you, Kieran Northrup." Joy transformed his face as he slipped the ring onto her finger. Then, with infinite gentleness, he drew her into his arms and lowered his mouth to hers. Their first kiss was tender, almost reverent, a promise exchanged without words. When they parted, Clara saw in Kieran's eyes all the love and commitment she had once feared she would never find again. "Merry Christmas, Clara," he whispered against her hair. "Merry Christmas," she replied, nestling closer into his embrace, where she fit as perfectly as if she had always belonged there. The new year brought changes to Northrup Ranch. With their engagement announced and the wedding planned for spring, Clara and the children moved into the main house. Kieran insisted on propriety. He would sleep in the small room off his study until they were properly married, but having them under one roof felt right. A family coming together. Emma and Thomas blossomed in the new arrangement. Emma took to following Clara around the house, learning the domestic arts with an eagerness that surprised everyone. Thomas attached himself to Kieran, soaking up knowledge about horses and ranch life like a sponge. One evening in February, Clara found Kieran in his study, poring over account books with a furrowed brow. "Is something wrong?" she asked, setting a cup of coffee beside him. He looked up, his expression clearing at the sight of her. "Not wrong exactly, just planning." He gestured to the papers spread before him, deeds, bank statements, letters. "I've been thinking about the future, our future." Clara settled into the chair opposite his desk. "And what have you concluded?" "That I want to make sure you and the children are secure, no matter what happens." He pushed a document toward her. "This is the deed to the ranch. I've had my lawyer draw up papers adding your name to it." Clara stared at the paper, stunned by the implications. "Kieran, I can't accept this." "You can and you will," he said firmly. "When we marry, what's mine becomes yours, that's the law. But I want it official on paper where no one can question it. This ranch will belong to you and the children, even if something happens to me." "Nothing is going to happen to you," Clara protested, a thread of fear winding through her at the very thought. Kieran's expression softened. "Of course not, God willing. But I've lived enough to know that life offers no guarantees. I want to know that you'll never again be in the position you were in after Daniel died, desperate, with no options." Clara reached across the desk to take his hand. "I appreciate the thought behind this, truly, but it feels overwhelming." "It's not charity, Clara," Kieran said, understanding her hesitation. "It's partnership. This ranch has become what it is largely because of you, your work, your care, the home you've made here. I'm just making official what's already true." Put that way, Clara found she couldn't argue. She had invested herself in Northrup Ranch, had poured her energy and creativity into making it not just a working cattle and horse operation, but a true home. The thought that it could be hers, truly hers in name as well as spirit, was both terrifying and exhilarating. "All right," she said finally. "If you're certain." "I've never been more certain of anything," Kieran said. He leaned back in his chair, studying her with a look of such tenderness it made her heart ache. "Except perhaps my decision to ride into Ardmore that night." Clara smiled, thinking of how far they had come from that desperate evening when she had stood trembling outside the dusty boot saloon. "Divine intervention, perhaps, or just good timing," Kieran said pragmatically. "Either way, I thank God for it daily." As winter gave way to spring, preparations for the wedding intensified. Clara, with Emma's eager assistance, sewed a wedding dress of soft ivory satin, ordered specially from a shop in Kansas City. The ranch hands, under Kieran's direction, built a proper gazebo in the garden where the ceremony would take place. Clara's sister Jane arrived a week before the wedding, bringing her husband and their 2 sons. The reunion was tearful and joyous, the sisters clinging to each other as if making up for the years of separation. "He's a good man, your Kieran," Jane said after meeting her future brother-in-law. "I can see it in how he looks at you, how he is with the children." "He is," Clara agreed. "Better than I ever imagined finding again. And the ranch is beautiful," Jane continued, gazing out at the green hills and the horses grazing in the distance. "You've landed on your feet, sister. After everything you've been through, you deserve this happiness." The day of the wedding dawned clear and perfect, as if even the weather wished to bless their union. Roses and wildflowers, gathered by Emma and arranged by Jane, decorated the gazebo and the porch of the main house. Tables had been set up under the old oak tree, laden with food prepared by Clara's friends from town and the neighboring ranches. In her cabin, which now served as guest quarters for Jane's family, Clara stood before the small mirror as her sister fastened the last buttons of her wedding dress. "There," Jane said, stepping back to admire her work. "You look like an angel." Clara hardly recognized herself in the ivory gown with its delicate lace collar and fitted bodice. Her hair, usually confined in a practical bun, fell in soft waves around her shoulders, adorned only with a crown of small white flowers Emma had insisted on making for her. "You think he'll be pleased?" Clara asked, a flutter of nerves making her voice unsteady. Jane laughed. "Clara Harlow, that man would think you beautiful in a flour sack. But yes, when he sees you in this dress, I expect he might forget his own name for a moment." A knock at the door announced Thomas, solemn in his new suit, come to escort his mother to the ceremony. "Mama," he breathed, his eyes wide, "you look like a princess." Clara knelt to his level, careful of her dress. "Thank you, my brave boy. Are you ready for your important job?" Thomas nodded, his expression serious. "Mr. Northrup, I mean Pa," he corrected himself, trying out the new title, "said I'm the man of our family, so I get to give you away." Clara's heart swelled at the easy way Thomas had adopted Kieran as his father. That's right, and no one could do it better. With Jane carrying her small bouquet of roses, Clara took Thomas's offered arm and stepped out into the spring sunshine. The assembled guests, ranch hands and their families, townspeople from Ardmore, neighboring ranchers turned to watch as she approached the gazebo where Kieran waited with the Reverend Miller. Emma stood at his side, proudly serving as their only attendant, her green dress matching the new leaves on the trees. But Clara saw only Kieran, tall and handsome in his dark suit, his blue eyes fixed on her with an expression of such wonder and love that her steps faltered momentarily. He reached out his hand as she approached, and Clara placed hers in it, feeling the strength and warmth of his grip. Thomas, executing his role with dignity beyond his years, solemnly gave his mother's hand to Kieran before joining Emma at their side. The ceremony itself was simple but profound. They exchanged traditional vows, their voices steady and sure as they promised to love, honor, and cherish each other for all their days. When Kieran slipped the gold band onto her finger to join her pearl engagement ring, Clara felt a sense of completion, of rightness that brought tears to her eyes. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Miller declared. "What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." Kieran's kiss was gentle but filled with promise, appropriate for the public setting but hinting at the deeper passion they would share in private. The celebration that followed lasted well into the evening. There was feasting and dancing, laughter and a few happy tears. Clara moved through it all in a state of joyful disbelief. her hand rarely leaving Kieran's, as if to reassure herself that this happiness was real and lasting. As twilight deepened into night, the guests began to depart, calling final congratulations as they rode or drove away. Jane, with a knowing smile, announced that she and her husband would take Emma and Thomas to the cabin for the night, giving the newlyweds privacy for their first evening as husband and wife. At last, Clara and Kieran stood alone on the porch of what was now truly their home. The spring air was soft with the scent of flowers, and the first stars had appeared in the darkening sky. "Mrs. Northrup," Kieran said, the name still new and wonderful on his lips. "May I carry you over the threshold?" Before Clara could answer, he had swept her into his arms, cradling her against his chest as if she weighed nothing. She laughed, wrapping her arms around his neck as he carried her through the door and into their shared future. Later, much later, as they lay in the quiet darkness of their bedroom, Clara rested her head on Kieran's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "Are you happy, Clara?" he asked softly, his hand gently stroking her hair. She propped herself up on one elbow to look into his face, barely visible in the dim light from the banked fire. "Happier than I ever thought possible," she answered truthfully. "You've given me so much, Kieran, not just security for myself and my children, but hope, a future, love." He traced the curve of her cheek with tender fingers. "You've given me just as much," he said. "A family, a purpose beyond just building a ranch, a reason to be a better man every day." Clara settled back against him, content in a way that once would have seemed impossible. From desperate widow selling herself to survive, to beloved wife and mistress of a prosperous ranch, the journey seemed almost too extraordinary to believe. Yet here she was, in the arms of a man who had seen her at her lowest and still found her worthy of love and respect. A man who had offered her not just survival but dignity. A man who had become father to her children and partner in her life. "I love you, Kieran Northrup," she whispered. "And I love you, Clara Northrup," he replied, his arms tightening around her, "now and always." Epilogue. 5 years later, the summer sun beat down on Northrup Ranch, turning the pastures golden and warming the backs of the horses that grazed contentedly behind sturdy fences. From her rocking chair on the wide front porch, Clara Northrup surveyed the scene with quiet satisfaction. In the 5 years since her marriage to Kieran, the ranch had prospered beyond their expectations. The gamble on the wild black stallion, now their prized breeding animal, had paid off handsomely. Northrup horses were becoming known throughout the territory for their strength, intelligence, and endurance, commanding premium prices at auction. The main house had expanded to accommodate their growing family. A new wing had been added the previous year, providing additional bedrooms and a larger kitchen where Clara still enjoyed preparing meals, though she now had help from a young woman from town who came in 3 days a week. Emma, now 12, sat on the porch steps, reading aloud to her younger sister. Catherine Rose Northrup, born 2 years after Clara and Kieran's wedding, listened with rapt attention, her blue eyes so like her father's wide with wonder at the story. Thomas, 10 years old and already showing his stepfather's gift with horses, was visible in the distance, helping Kieran and Hank with a new foal in the training corral. The boy had grown tall for his age, with a quiet confidence that Clara attributed to Kieran's patient mentoring. And in Clara's arms, 3-month-old James Daniel Northrup slept peacefully, his tiny fist curled around her finger. The baby had been a surprise. Clara had thought her childbearing years were behind her, but a welcome one. Kieran had been overjoyed at the news, and even more so when the healthy boy had arrived after an easy birth. Life wasn't perfect, of course. There had been challenges: a drought 2 years ago that had threatened their hay crop, a bout of colic that had nearly taken Catherine when she was 2, occasional disagreements between Clara and Kieran as they navigated the complexities of marriage and business. But they had faced each challenge together, their partnership strengthening with each obstacle overcome. And the love between them, far from fading with familiarity, had deepened into something Clara treasured more with each passing year. The sound of hoofbeats drew Clara's attention back to the present. Kieran was riding toward the house, Thomas perched proudly in front of him on the saddle. They made a handsome pair, both with sun-browned faces and easy smiles. "Mama," Thomas called as they neared. "Pa says I can start training my own colt next month." "That's wonderful, sweetheart," Clara called back. "But remember what we discussed about responsibility." I know," Thomas said with the slight impatience of a boy eager to prove himself a man. "A horse isn't a toy, it's a partnership." Kieran dismounted, then lifted Thomas down before tying the horse to the hitching post. He climbed the porch steps, pausing to ruffle Catherine's dark curls and drop a kiss on Emma's head before joining Clara. "How's our boy?" he asked, gently touching the baby's cheek with one calloused finger. "Perfect," Clara replied. "He just ate and fell asleep." Kieran settled into the rocking chair beside hers, reaching over to take her free hand in his. "And his mother, how are you feeling today?" "Tired," Clara admitted with a smile, "but happy." Kieran's eyes, still as blue and direct as the day they had met, searched her face with tender concern. "You're doing too much. I've told you we can afford more help around the house." Clara squeezed his hand reassuringly. "I like being busy. Besides, Jane is coming next week to stay for a month. Between her and Ellen from town, I'll have plenty of help." Kieran nodded, though she could tell he wasn't entirely convinced. His protectiveness had only increased with each child, his determination to ensure Clara never worked too hard, sometimes bordering on amusing. "I received a letter from that cavalry officer in Fort Sill," he said, changing the subject. "He wants 20 of our horses for the army. It would be our biggest sale yet." "That's wonderful news," Clara said, genuinely pleased. Their business success meant security for their children. Education for Emma, who dreamed of becoming a teacher, perhaps even a small ranch of his own someday for Thomas. "I was thinking," Kieran continued, his thumb tracing circles on the back of her hand, "that with this sale, we might take that trip to Denver we've talked about. The older children have never seen a city, and your sister could stay with the little ones." Clara considered the idea. A journey just for pleasure was a luxury they could now afford, but had rarely indulged in. "That sounds lovely," she agreed. "Perhaps in the fall when the weather is cooler." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching Catherine chase a butterfly across the yard while Emma returned to her book. From inside the house came the sounds of their housekeeper preparing supper, the comforting domestic noises of a busy, happy home. "You ever think about it?" Kieran asked suddenly, his voice low enough that only Clara could hear. "That night in Ardmore, how close we came to never meeting." Clara knew exactly what he meant. The question of divine intervention versus coincidence had been a recurring theme in their discussions over the years. "I think about it often," she admitted. "What if you hadn't come to Ardmore that night? What if you had chosen a different saloon? What if you hadn't noticed me outside? What if you had refused my offer?" Kieran added. "You could have. Many women would have, suspicious of a stranger's motives." Clara looked down at their joined hands, his large and sun-darkened, hers smaller but equally work-worn. "I was desperate," she said softly, "but not so desperate that I would have accepted just any offer. There was something about you, Kieran. Something that made me trust you despite every reason not to." "Divine intervention, then," he said with a small smile. Perhaps, Clara agreed. Or perhaps just the recognition of a good man when I needed one most. Kieran raised her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles in an echo of the gesture that had so moved her the night he had proposed. Whatever it was, I thank God for it every day. As the sun began to set, painting the Oklahoma sky in shades of pink and gold, Clara looked around at the life she and Kieran had built together, their children, their home, their love that had grown from the most unlikely beginning into something strong and enduring. From desperation to dignity, from survival to joy, it had been a journey Clara could never have imagined that night outside the dusty boot saloon. Yet here she was, surrounded by abundance, secure in the knowledge that she was loved completely and would never again have to choose between her dignity and her children's welfare. "Come inside soon," she said, rising carefully with the sleeping baby. "Supper will be ready shortly." Kieran nodded, his eyes following her with the same admiration and tenderness they had held for 5 years. "I'll round up the children and be right in." As Clara carried little James into the house that was truly her home, she offered a silent prayer of gratitude for second chances, for unexpected kindness, and for the love that had transformed her life when she least expected it. She had once been a woman willing to sell herself to feed her children. Now she was a wife, a mother, a partner in a thriving ranch, her worth measured not in the money men would pay for her body, but in the family that treasured her heart and the life she had helped to build. It was, Clara thought as she laid her youngest son in his cradle, the most precious gift of all to be loved for herself, completely and without reservation, by a man who had seen her at her most vulnerable and still found her worthy of everything he had to give. "Thank you," she whispered, though whether to God or to Kieran or simply to the universe that had brought them together, even Clara herself couldn't say. All she knew was that gratitude filled her heart to overflowing, and that the love she had found with Kieran Northrup was a testament to the possibility of redemption, of new beginnings, of happiness found in the most unexpected of places. And that, she decided as she heard Kieran's laugh mingle with the children's outside, was more than enough.